Okay, so this game was a very interesting one. I figured it might be a little more interesting to play a match that was in the classical instead of rapid, meaning that there was a 15-minute game with 10-second increments, meaning you essentially had a lot of time to make your moves and sort of think for a little bit, and that's what ended up happening. And as a result, this game ended up being a lot longer than the other six or so videos that have been put out so far. Um, but what's interesting about this one is I don't think I've ever had a game quite like this before. The game itself ended up being 53 moves, um, with my opponent on white and with me on black. So right off the bat, there's a little bit weirdness going on because he begins with the Amar opening, which is infamously known, for those of you who don't know, as the worst chess opening uh, ever, essentially, because there's really no purpose for this. You never want to have your knight on a side, and he basically boots right into that, and is only given three moves and it's past that. So I match with my usual opening, which is uh, my knight to f6, and so he sort of mirrors that on the b file, and so I'm opening it with my queen. He's putting two threat on this pawn right here, so which doesn't matter because it's already double protected. And so I just threaten the knight while continuing developing. He takes, which is a terrible move. I end up taking on my own. He takes, now I take. Now I'm up two. Right off the bat, this is only the fifth move of the game. And so at this point, I think it's going to be an easy win because it's kind of hard to screw up this early in the game like that. But it ends up being a much closer game than I thought because he starts development on the C file, and so I do so on the F. He immediately checks my king, and so I block with my knight, and pinning this knight, so he continues developing, and I move my bishop here, sort of devising a plan to move my knight maybe over here, or not over there, but just over here, so that he can be tempted to taking it, and then my bishop take it, because don't forget at this point, I kind of assume he's not a very experienced player, and that I could get away with it. Unfortunately, he decides to retreat his queen over to the h file, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense either because he can't take here because of the pawn right here, and he can't take here because of the rook. So there's not really a lot he can do. So I start to think of a way that I can trap him if he decides to think of something funny. I move my queen right here, protected by the knight, and sort of giving a little protection here. And this is going to come in hand much later on when the queen is stuck. He moves in, check, and so I threaten and protect the king with this right here, this pawn on the g file. He moves up one, now threatening this pawn, and so I move my bishop to f7. I can't just move this one up to threaten him, because then he can move right back down here for check, and then at that point I no longer have any protection. So instead of that, he moves to h6, trying to sneak in here. I don't understand exactly what his plan. I think, oh, I remember now. He wanted to move right here, so that way he can threaten my rook. And so after I protect this bad boy right here, he moves exactly where I think he's going to move. He moves to g7, so I respond by castling. Now he can no longer take it, and he is very limited on his ability to move back out because he can only move to this 6. So I want to make sure he can't get out in any way. He makes that a little easier for me by moving further in. Now he can no longer leave through the H file, and his only way out is through this diagonal. So I respond by moving my rook to d5, attempting to trap this queen right here. And so he responds by threatening this rook with a bishop. So I go ahead and just move it to the side because now, by moving this bishop to c4, he has now blocked his own queen from getting out, and he can only move as far as here, which would inevitably be taken by my rook. So he responds with b4, now forking between the rook and the queen. And at this point, I'm a little nervous because I don't know what's going to happen. So I sort of take a gamble here. I move my rook to f8, knowing full well that he can just take the pawn right here, but I'm trying to buy myself a little bit of time to try and see what I can do about this situation right here. He responds by checking on e6, and so I kind of have to do something about this. So I move my king right here. So now it's pretty inevitable that something is going to be taken here, but what he seemed to have not understood when he put me in check on the on e6 is that I have this bishop right here protecting. So he responds by taking my queen. I take his. He takes back on bishop, and then knight takes a5. And so I kind of try, as soon as he moves this rook right here, and I protect the pawn, and he threatens my rook, and I move it back, threatening the bishop. I'm trying to think of an idea where I can trap this guy as well. I was thinking of moving my f-pawn up. I was trying to see if there's anything I can do right here, because he can't really move here. He can't move here. He can only really move right here. But he ends up doing it for me, because as soon as he threatens my rook, where my rook can no longer really go anywhere because he's under threat on every possible square he can move to, I take, he takes, I take again, putting me up 1 point. So at this point, this is where things start to get interesting. After he castles, I can no longer castle because I was put in check and had to move earlier by the queen. I start to develop a little more. His white rook threatens my black bishop, and so I pull that back, and I have an idea here. Notice how I pulled back the bishop onto the d square so that I can focus this pawn right here. I'm going to try to walk my knight up here, and if he moves down, whatever, I have a backup plan, and we'll get to that in a minute. He starts moving his rook right here, I guess trying to give himself a little visual right here. I don't quite understand this, and so I just go ahead and move my knight to e5. He threatens both pieces for whatever reason, even though both of them are protected and are worth less than a rook. So I go ahead and make my move here. Obviously, his best move should have been here, but my whole idea here being to try and open up the king's defense. He does not, however, and so he begins developing his c-pawn. And so I go ahead and take, and he's forced to move his rook to protect it from being taken. And so at this point, I go ahead and threaten his rook, which is obviously a bad mistake because, well, that was a pawn that was protecting the bishop. I don't know how I ended up making this mistake. I think it was just too quick thinking. I got a little ahead of myself. So obviously he takes, puts me in check, and I go ahead and threaten rook. He starts pawn hunting, and so I take the opportunity to pull my knight back, and he can't take any more pawns because they're all protected where the rook is, and so I start developing an idea here, trying to threaten this pawn right here. He responds with his own rook, and so from here I begin moving my knight so that I can move it here, and then here, threaten the rook so that he would move, and then I can move my rook right here, protecting the knight that would be there, putting me up another pawn. But as soon as he puts me in check here, I offer a trade because that's really the best option, because if I move the king, he takes the pawn over on the a square. And so he does not accept this trade and moves back to the c file, and so I continue my plan of taking this pawn. So I move my knight right there, and he begins developing his a pawn as well. And so I finally fork it out right here, and now if he chooses to go here, I can also just move my knight and take this pawn now as well. That's not what he does. Interestingly enough, he actually moves it to the C file, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally, but maybe he saw something I didn't. And so I just go ahead and took. He begins moving this pawn, and so it's obvious what he wants to do with this pawn. He wants to get me to take it so that his rook can take it, and then both of his rooks have a lot more room to sort of jump around and do whatever it needs. Unfortunately for him, I saw this and happened to have a rook right nearby, so he can no longer take back because it is now protected by the pawn that he was expecting to take. So with this, he just moves his king over, and I move my h-pawn up, starting development, and then for whatever reason he moves to h, to a pawn that I literally just developed the move before. So I go ahead and take the pawn that I was initially going to take because he hasn't moved his rook back to protect it. From here he puts me in check, so I move my king up to the 6th row, and so now he is threatening this pawn, so I go ahead and develop it, and then he moves his king to threaten my rook. So I go ahead and pull that back, but as you can see from here, by moving his king to the e file, he is now under threat of me moving my rook here, putting him in check and forking between the king and the rook. Unfortunately, he does not see this and goes ahead and takes a pawn with his rook on a7, and so I go ahead and do exactly that, and I fork between the king and the rook. He has to move the king, and so I take the rook. He takes the knight, putting my rook in danger, and so I go ahead and start taking pawns. He threatens upon the a square, but it's kind of an empty threat because I can also take one, and when he puts me in check, I can just move here, now protecting every pawn. now with everything protected in its immediate vicinity. And so, for whatever reason, he moves to d6, kind of an empty movement. I think he's just trying to get things over. So I start developing this h-pawn, trying to get it up all the way so I can promote it so that I can put him in checkmate. So he puts me in check. A couple movements of the development, and eventually um, he takes. I don't know if he didn't realize or he just needed to move or whatnot, because I immediately take back, and now his only pawn is pinned, and he's left to his king, and he has plenty of room to move, so it's not possible to stalemate. And in this position, White resigned the game. 53rd move in. There wasn't really anything he could do. In this situation, the only thing he can move is his king. If he moved it here, I could take. He moves it, move it, checkmate. Uh, but either way, I think this was an interesting game. I probably should start playing some more classical before I continue going into the longer matches. But yeah.